Here are the first pictures of strike-paralyzed San Francisco in the grip of a general labor tie-up. Streets are deserted as surface cars cease running, and citizens unable to travel remain indoors. Only a few automobiles can operate because most filling stations have exhausted their supplies and can obtain no more gasoline. Motor trucks stand idle where their drivers left them. Very little food is being moved into the city, and with the threat of famine before them, crowds jam the markets. But supplies dwindle rapidly, and there is no meat to be had. To the possibility of mob violence is added fear of pestilence, while on every hand closed shops give mute testimony to the disastrous economic consequence of the strike. Mayor Rossi states the position of his administration.
I must insist, first, that law and order shall prevail. Second, that those desiring to furnish the people of San Francisco with the necessities of life must be permitted to do so without hindrance. Third, that the municipal government must continue to function. The general public must and shall be served. I again appeal to the interested parties to permit the President's Arbitration Board to settle the controversy which besets us.
By the late 1930s, Bridges was appointed West Coast Director of the Congress of Industrial Organizations, the CIO. His outfit was now called the International Longshoremen and Warehousemen's Union and had expanded to include men and women in other trades and regions. For this effort, Harry brought in a brilliant organizer, Lou Goldblatt, and together they formulated a policy that, unlike other unions, combined political goals with economic issues.
I'm an officer of a left-wing trade union, and that's the way those people think, and as long as my rank and file feel that way, my job is to represent them that way.
What do you mean by a left-wing trade union?
Well, obviously, on the record, it's a union that means that's willing to arbitrate. To start with. That's a matter of record. It's also a union that believes in a lot of rank-and-file democracy and control. It's a union, I'm giving you my definitions now, of a left-wing union. It's a union that believes that its officers should be easy to remove and should function under a setup where their wages and expenses are no more than the highest paid at the most. The highest paid worker, that's a member of the union. It's also a union that recognizes that from time to time it's got to stand up and fight for certain things that mightn't necessarily only be wages, hours, and conditions. Civil liberties, racial equality, and things like that.
The growing economic muscle of the longshoremen soon found political expression when in 1938 they refused to handle scrap iron bound for Japan.
When we shut down ships and we refused to ship oil and scrap iron to Japan when it invaded China, that was a very radical, revolutionary thing. I got a telegram from Mr. Roosevelt saying, hey, quit interfering in the good diplomatic relationships between two nations. Well, I put that at the time. But we still shut down the ships. And we said at the time, that scrap iron is going to come back on the heads of American boys. It did at Pearl Harbor.
What you're doing when you do that is to interfere with the foreign policy of your country.
Sure as hell are. That's our job, that's our privilege, and that's our right, and that's our duty.
While the Pacific Coast Union favored the political left, the East was a stronghold of the right. ILA President Joseph Ryan was a strident anti-communist. But Ryan's patriotism was mostly a pose. Word was that the fatherly labor boss had gone far beyond the usual waterfront corruption into an unholy alliance with the sinister operatives of Murder Incorporated.
Brooklyn, across the river, the city of friendly people sometimes called Dodgerville. 3 great bridges span the East River, linking the borough of Brooklyn with downtown Manhattan. The first bridge to span the East River from Brooklyn was the Brooklyn Bridge, completed in 1883, and the longest suspension bridge at the time. With the rapid growth of Brooklyn, other bridges became necessary. In 1909, the Williamsburg Bridge was opened to traffic, and not long after that, the Manhattan Bridge. But Brooklyn keeps on growing with a population of almost 3 million people. For Brooklyn is also a great industrial city with miles upon miles of waterfront, sometimes called the stepping-off point of the world. Brooklyn buys what the world has to sell and sells to the world about everything under the sun. Made in Brooklyn. The Made in Brooklyn trademark is known in every corner of the civilized world. Ships from all parts of the world make Brooklyn a port of call. Ships that move Made in Brooklyn products across the 7 seas to lands beyond the horizon. Ships that sail in the night and ships that sail in the day. For Brooklyn never sleeps.
New York Harbor in the 1930s was America's postcard to the world. Streaked with ships, spiked with piers, bejeweled with bridges, and studded with American symbolism. Chelsea Pier, where the great transatlantic ocean liners docked. Ellis Island, the Statue of Liberty. And it had the muscle to go with the image.
If you take it all of the docks, Manhattan, Brooklyn, Staten Island, Jersey, it amounts to 700 miles of docks, about 2,000 piers in all. And during these years, the 30s, the 40s, something like a quarter of all the American import-export business is flowing through the port of New York.
But the great harbor, with its sentinel of liberty, was also a bog of corruption. A criminal alliance ruled the docks, comprised of the mob, the ship owners, City Hall, and ILA President Joe Ryan. He was called King Joe on the waterfront, or Nickel and Dime Ryan, for the miserly way he doled out contract concessions to longshoremen. As the story goes, the shipping bosses would ask Ryan what he needed to keep the boys in line. Ryan would answer, "If they won't take a nickel, give them a dime." It worked. There had been no strikes on the New York waterfront since the end of World War I.
Ryan was told by his masters that they didn't want any strikes, and so, remarkably, for a quarter century, from the end of the First War to the end of the Second World War, there were no strikes on the New York waterfront, because the powers that be didn't want them.
Unlike his West Coast counterpart, Harry Bridges, Ryan lived the high life. He wore expensive suits, belonged to several country clubs, and threw lavish dinner parties that became famous both for who was there and who was not. Rank-and-file longshoremen were conspicuously absent, though they had been leaned on to buy expensive tickets for the dinners. Only the chosen few made it to King Joe's table.
People who were invited to those dinners was a who's who amongst the underworld. but also the political establishment of New York City, but also of New York State. And in a sense, that showed you the reach that Joe Ryan had.
Among the underworld's who's who was Albert Anastasia. Anastasia had penetrating eyes and a long history of mayhem on the waterfront. Back in 1921, Anastasia had been sentenced to the chair for murdering a longshoreman. But when the witnesses mysteriously changed their stories, Anastasia managed to walk free. By the late 30s, Anastasia had muscled his way to the top of Brooklyn's Mangano crime family. Fellow mobsters called him the Mad Hatter.
Albert was the toughest and the craziest. He had a reputation for just flaring violence out of nowhere, killing a man for no good reason. That was his solution to any problem. Clip him, clip him. So that gave him great power, great deference, because he was known to be crazy and a killer.
Under Anastasia's orders, Joe Ryan hired men with criminal records to work on the New York docks, just giving the boys a second chance, as Ryan would say. Except that in many cases, these ex-cons were Mafia soldiers whose job it was to steal whatever they could haul off the docks.
In a sense, it was a form of taxation by the union officials and by the mobsters, which was generally accepted by the New York Shipping Association.
The business was so lucrative then and non-competitive that the extra amounts of money they were paying in extortion to organized crime, in extortion to the unions, still allowed them to have an enormously profitable business.
Anastasia's brother, Anthony, ran the Brooklyn locals of the Longshoremen's Union. His nickname, Tough Tony, came from his years in a ship's hold. Tough Tony was a longshoreman through and through.
Tough Tony loved longshore work, the dead reckoning of how to load a ship, of where to place things so it was balanced right and you could get as much into the ship as possible. He actually worked on the docks and was a leader. I mean, if you looked at Tough Tony, you'd say, this man is a leader of men.
Tough Tony ran his docks like an old-fashioned padrone from Sicily. Longshoremen would have to pay tribute, as much as 25% of their salary, or they would never be picked out of the shape-up.
There's even an interview, if it wasn't so sad, you know, it would be hilarious, of a longshoreman who says, well, in the morning, the union delegate came around and I gave him a kickback. And then in the afternoon, another guy came around and he asked for another kickback. And I says, I couldn't give it to him. He says, after that, I haven't worked for 6 weeks.
And so it went on the New York waterfront. The mob controlled the rackets, while City Hall raked in the bribes and the votes, and King Joe and Tough Tony kept the longshoremen in line. This was the great cabal of power that Pete Panto took on in 1939. Panto was 38 years old, by all accounts a refugee from Mussolini's Italy. Like thousands of other Italians, he landed on the docks of Brooklyn. He carried 75-pound bags of coffee on his back until he was promoted to hiring boss. Having fled fascist Italy, the American underworld held few terrors for him. Panto began speaking out against the Anastasias and Ryans of the waterfront. As leader of a movement called the Rank and File Committee, Panto staged rallies at the entrances to the docks. In June 1939, 350 longshoremen were present for a Panto speech. By the time of the next rally, on July 3rd, the number of defiant longshoremen had grown to 1,500. Panto was getting people's attention, all kinds of people.
He was told to back off by the mob in Brooklyn, but he ignored that and he just carried on.
Panto was a brave man. He knew the stakes. He knew how dangerous it was. He'd been warned. Albert Anastasia, the feared Mad Hatter of the Brooklyn docks, was telling him to stop doing it. And he kept doing it.
On the evening of July 14th, 1939, Panto returned from the docks to his rented room. As was his custom, he laid out his work clothes across his bed for the next morning. He then left for a meeting. He was uncharacteristically nervous, telling his fiance's brother that he didn't trust the men he was meeting with. He also said that if he didn't return the next morning, they should call the police. Panto wasn't seen the next morning, or the next. His family called the police, who refused to investigate. Just another longshoreman who ran off with a woman was their story. On the docks, his position was immediately filled, and the new hiring boss refused to hire members of Panto's rank-and-file committee. That's when longshoremen began covering the waterfront with the graffiti, "Where is Pete Panto?" It became the haunting mantra of the Brooklyn docks.
But of course, as most of the longshoremen realized, Pete Panto was gone. He was dead.
When the story behind Panto's disappearance came out in March of 1940, it appeared that authorities had the Mad Hatter dead to rights. A gangster and former Murder Incorporated hitman named Abe Reles began to sing to the police. He pinned 16 separate murders on Albert Anastasia, including that of Pete Panto. Panto's last meeting, according to Reles, was with two men who offered him a bribe. When Panto refused the cash, his fate was sealed. The Mad Hatter himself allegedly gave the order to kill the longshoreman and dump his body in a New Jersey lime pit. Reles even led police to the lime pit, where they found Panto's remains.
What is remarkable is what happens in the next few days. D.A. O'Dwyer, he's the D.A. for Kings County, Brooklyn, meets with various Longshore officials, Joe Ryan, Emil Camarda, the boss of the so-called Camarda locals in Brooklyn. And a few days later, the case is abruptly dropped.
You had the perfect murder case. You had the murderer. You had the smoking gun. And nobody goes to trial. There was never a case brought to trial against Albert Anastasia.
In November 1941, Abe Reles reportedly fell from the window of his Coney Island hotel, conveniently eliminating the principal witness against Albert Anastasia. Pete Panto had defied the waterfront powers and had paid the price. Murdered by gangsters, the crime covered up by politicians, his movement suppressed by the corrupt union.
The fearlessness of the man, knowing the stakes, he worked on the docks. The day he was taken off and killed, he'd put in a day on the Moore McCormick docks. He's a hero. He must have been fearless. He knew the stakes and he kept doing it. Extraordinary.
And so the message was clearly made to the longshoremen about, if you decide to challenge us, this is what's going to happen.
Commissioners soon zeroed in on the longtime king of the New York waterfront, Joe Ryan. By now, Ryan had been president of the Longshore Union for a quarter of a century, hanging on to his job by strike busting and by shameless red baiting.
And this is one of the reasons why Joe Ryan is left alone for so long. Whenever he's brought up in front of Congress in on some sort of subcommittee or something like that, he always brings up the communist issue, and he always labels the West Coast guys as being the Reds, dominated by Bridges, whilst in New York City he says these sort of people, we either crackheads or we run them off the docks.
My philosophy of life. Do it to him before he does it to you. What do you want?
Your gun. We got the baddest piers and the baddest harbor in the world. Everything moves in and out, we take our gun.
I better get you home. There's too many guys around here with only one thing in their mind. Am I going to see you again?
What for? I really don't know.
Have fun. Come on. Edie.
Father, who'd want to kill Joey? Who'd want to kill Joey?
Listen, you know who the pistols are. You're going to keep still until they cut you down one by one? Get a doctor!
Stay away from me!
Talk yourself in the river.